Welcome to Product Academy Tough Stuff, the podcast where we cut through the noise and get straight to the toughest challenges in product management. I'm Tanja Lau.
And I'm Francesca Cortesi.
In each episode, we tackle one tough question. No fluff, no filler. Just candid insights from seasoned product leaders.
Our guests deliver actionable, real-world answers. Whether you're an experienced product leader or just stepping into the product world, this is your go-to podcast for sharp, tested advice, condensed for your busy schedule.
One tough challenge, practical insights, short and real.
Let's dive in.
Hello, Chiedza. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Thank you for having me, Tanja. Thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Same. So our topic today, our tough question is, what makes a senior PM senior? And I have worked with a lot of product people in the past, and I think a lot of them fall into one of two categories. One is either they think they are more senior than they actually are, and they keep asking for promotions before they're ready, or they're actually so ready for the next step, but maybe are held back by their own imposter syndrome or don't see like how experienced they actually are. So it's quite difficult to assess your own seniority. Is there anything, if we tackle it from the reverse side, let's say, is there anything that you think is a cautionary sign that somebody is not senior yet? How can you tell?
Oh, this is such a good question. And I was trying to think about a really good way to answer this, because I do feel like sometimes people can be very abstract in an answer and then they don't really take away. And for me, I find it really helpful to try to have some sort of an image of something real that you can liken it to. So I thought of two things. I thought about learning how to drive and a baby walking. So we think about when we're learning how to drive, you have the theory part, right, which is where you have to do a lot of studying and then you go into the exam. And there's a threshold, like a pass mark that you have to get before you can start the practical part. At least that's how it works in Zimbabwe. But then there's certain questions that if you don't pass those questions, then you actually can't even go into the sort of practical side of things. And I see this, and even though when you start the practical, you still have to put the learning plates on the car, right? So everybody knows that you're still learning. So for me, I would think that some signs are someone who's kind of gone over some of those stages, right? So maybe not quite grasped some of the stuff in the theory, and then maybe has taken that L plate off a little bit too fast. And I think when we think about product management, is one of the first is credible escalations that just keep coming about the same person. And I'm very careful to say credible, because sometimes people do escalate without necessarily having all the right information or the right context, and then maybe putting the blame on someone when it's not fair. So I think when you are in a leadership position and you keep getting the same escalations about the same person with similar themes like lack of prioritization or very late engagement with other teams, or other people feeling uncomfortable working with that person, I think those are things that are signs that, okay, what's going on with this person? They clearly are having more responsibility and more of an impact than maybe they are actually ready for, and maybe not being so aware, which leads me to the second part, which is self-awareness, right? So are you aware of the impact that you're actually having on others when you do some of these things? Because if we think about product organizations, they're usually in a state of flux. Things are changing a lot. There's a lot of communicating, over-communicating, repetition. And I think sometimes we do get lost in the details and then forget to do this coordination. And this can be very stressful for all the other teams that we have to work with. And I think when you keep getting this constant sort of stress right at the end, and it's the same person, then these are signs that maybe they've got too much on their plate or have too much responsibility, and they're not quite ready to handle it and balance all of these things. And then the last one is acknowledgement of others and the input that others have had into your success and what you've done. So let's say you've had a successful launch, and that person is not really sort of acknowledging that, yes, they've been a big part of it, but they've had so many other people around them, because that also then leads to other people not feeling like their work is valuable, or they don't really feel a part of that achievement. And we all know that those feelings end up festering And then you see it later on in the way people then collaborate. You know, maybe they're not so forthcoming as they feel like, well, I wasn't really acknowledged before, so why should I sort of collaborate more with this person? So those are some of the things that I would say that, you know, are signs that maybe someone has too much responsibility and they're not quite ready for the L plates to be ripped off.
Thanks for making it so tangible. Okay, so if we now return to the original question, what are areas in which you can assess seniority for a PM? What would you go into? In which directions should we look?
Yeah, so I mean, for the first one is communication. And when I say communication, this is not just talking to someone, right? It's about observing when they are communicating with others. Are they listening to understand other people, or they default to responding, right? So are they giving other people the space to share their thoughts, share their ideas, or even any space for dissent? And that's not an easy one, right? Because I know myself, I'm also a very sensitive person, and it hasn't always been very easy for me when there's dissent for me to be okay with that. Because, you know, my default, and for most of us, right, our default is, oh, I'm a really nice person and I am very open-minded and I do want to hear what other people have to say. But often our ego does get in the way, and this can then block really getting value from other people when they feel like they have to defend themselves when you are maybe a bit short and sharp. So communication is super important, because that also comes into, I'd thought about conflict resolution, but I think sometimes conflict is okay. You know, I'm one person who's always just like, conflict, I'm going to run in the other direction. But I think often when I have run away from conflict, it's caused even more problems. So really seeing that someone has a way of handling that conflict and bringing it to some sort of a resolution and some sort of a result, I think is very good. I think conflict avoidance, when we're thinking about seniority, is not such a good thing, because we do know that in product you are going to have these conflicts, whether it's conflict of where we put capacity, conflict of investment, whether that's monetary investment or people capital, all the things around, like, you know, let's say marketing team support, product operations. So there are always going to be conflicts, and people really having the ability to be able to resolve those in a way that is healthy is important. And then, of course, collaboration, everything around teamwork. So working well together. And I'm not saying these like you have to be 100% all the time on these, but I would be looking for someone who's senior that they are doing these at a high level most regularly. Of course, we're all human beings, right? We don't always have the capacity to be open and active listening and smiling. But yeah, that is that when people get feedback from others, that the default is that this person is doing those things well most of the time.
Yeah. Oh, great. So let me linger on that for a moment. So you said communication, and communication both ways. So for one, you have to set expectations. I think that's something you said when we were talking about the cautionary signs. I think that happens often with more junior people, that they fail to set expectations or adjust expectations when there is delays. Maybe that's also part of like avoiding the conflict of having to go to a stakeholder and tell them like, look, it's going to take longer than expected. But I think communication, like outbound communication, is also adjusting expectations, setting them correctly as much as possible. And then the other way around is like the inbound communication, listening and being easy to give feedback to. I think that's a phrase that I like a lot. I think I heard it from Lea Terrain first, because I think that is also what will propel you forward in your journey, I guess, right? If you're easy to give feedback to, you will get more feedback, because if you get defensive, people will maybe stop giving feedback at some point in time, and that limits your possibility to grow, right? So being easy to give feedback to. And I think all the things that we're talking about, especially the soft skills, those are things that you will also need in a leadership position. They're not exclusive to like being a senior PM, right? It's, as you were saying, it's something that we need to keep working on. But one thing that I wanted to add for the communication part, and here, if you agree, is like what I see with junior people sometimes is that they keep using the wrong channels for certain types of communication and messages, right? So they would send an email for something that you should rather discuss in person, or they would, I don't know, take someone's time for something that is actually just an email, right? So I think also getting like the experience in which channel to use for which kind of message, that's something I would add to the bucket of communication. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is where actually senior people come in as an example, right? So, the other sort of image I had in my head is when a child is learning to walk, they see others walking, right? And they will try to copy that person and see, oh, okay, if I stand up and I try to put my feet forward, like what happens? Am I going to be like that person? And sometimes they will fall, but the other person, like the older person, will pull them up and help them. And that's what senior PMs are supposed to be doing. So if you see someone making some of those mistakes, or you see that, okay, this meeting could have been an email, let that person know. That's the only way that they are going to be able to grow. So I know that for me, and I talk about this a lot. When I first started working, I was in an environment where, I was trying to walk and I was like walking into things and I was falling over. People were telling me, like, I even remember a boss sitting with me saying my emails were too long and it was difficult to understand what I wanted. So how can you be more succinct and more clear about what you want? Because he said that people then start thinking that you just keep waffling and people won't pay attention to you. And that was a game changer in the way that my emails were received. So I think that, and I think it ties nicely, right, to this, like what makes a senior PM. And that also falls into how you are a role model for others as well, that you are actively supporting the people in your team who are still trying to get to where you are, I think is a really good also indicator of someone who's senior.
Exactly. And also if you get invited into like board meetings or meetings that are above your pay grade, let's say, and people are confident to put you into those meetings to answer questions for shareholders and so on, that's a really good sign. And also to learn how to communicate on that level. Maybe you can ask for access to those meetings on certain occasions, to just be a silent listener, to also learn how to behave in these kind of contexts, because you can learn a lot from other people, how they phrase their requests or their statements in these settings. Yeah.
Yes. I have one quick one. Sorry, I know we're pressed on time.
No, all
strategic
good.
thinking. Strategic thinking. So, really joining the dots. What happens if we change this? What are all the impacts? Who do I need to communicate those changes to? What do those changes look like? Do they make sense? So obviously that whole thing about joining the dots across the piece as someone who's senior is very important. I mean, of course, sometimes you can ask your head of product or director, whoever's above you, also to sense check some of these things, which I think is fine, which I think is important, right? I think we shouldn't kind of give people these senior titles and say like, right, you just have to improve yourself. It's just like when you first start learning how to drive, you still get a bit anxious those first few days until you're used to it and you're more comfortable. And I think we shouldn't just rip away that support from people who, oh, now you have the title, you're good, which I think is not the case. We're all still learning, right? I get feedback from people all the time. It doesn't matter how long you've been working or how much experience you have. We always have an opportunity to grow.
Yeah. And I guess you're touching on something very important, which means for me, someone senior also knows when they need feedback. Right? Okay, this is something that I want someone else to double check. And this is something where I run on my own, right? And if you have more clarity on that, that's a good sign that you're becoming more senior, I think. And another thing that you just touched upon was this kind of holistic thinking. For me, that's also really important, that first of all, you understand what are the decisions that you are supposed to take. And if you're not clear on that, you're asking for this, right? That's something you don't operate in the void and in the fuzziness, right? You try to understand what's my scope, what am I paid for here, what does success look like? And then also, I think what I really like to see in people is when they look beyond their own scope and can also spot inconsistencies, or they can spot, oh, we're optimizing very locally here, but if I go for this goal and don't look left or right, we're gonna, like, globally not gonna reach what we want to achieve, actually. So these kind of things, that's a huge sign for me that someone is stepping up when it comes to seniority, and also giving pushback. And that's something you said before, like being comfortable with conflict in a way, and also knowing how to model it, giving pushback when you see that something doesn't make sense to you, because junior people tend to just execute whatever they're being given by someone who's more senior. But I think it's really good if you think on your own and keep your brain switched on, and even juniors should do that. I'm not saying this is something that should start when you're a senior, but it's something that I expect from a senior, I think.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think when you're talking about the decisions and the impact of maybe changes and pushback, one thing that I love is when people come with options. I think that's great. They say like, okay, this is what we have on the table. we can tackle this in 3 different ways. These are going to be all the different results if we do that, because that also then takes some of the stress and pressure off of me, because often when you're in a leadership position, you're not as close to the detail as others. But if someone gives you options, then it actually gives you a head start, and it helps you with what other questions can I ask. So I think someone coming with different options, and you can see that they've talked to their peers, they've talked to other teams, they've gathered information, and maybe bringing other people into the room as well when we're having that discussion. And I like what you talked about, being invited into those shareholder meetings. It's, when you see a senior PM come into that, maybe a prioritization meeting with a head of product or director, with the junior PM saying, hey, can this person join? I just want them to see how this can go. Then again, that is something that I also really encourage and really like to see.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think wrapping this up, I feel like there is this notion of like, to become senior, you have to spend a certain amount of years in a certain role, and then you get promoted at some point in time. But personally, and I'm curious about your opinion, I think it's not the amount of years that make you senior necessarily. It's more about the repetitions that you get for certain kinds of work and tasks that make you more senior. So if you're in a big corporation, but you only ship once in 3 years, right? You have had this learning cycle once, and maybe someone in a startup has shipped a lot of times in that period and has had more repetitions for certain kinds of work, and also is getting more experience and more exposed to different situations that way. So I feel like it can be one indicator how long you have been working in a PM role, but I also really want to pay attention to how many reps they had for certain kinds of situations. Is that something that makes sense to you, or do you see it differently?
I see it a little bit differently, because I think it's a very interesting perspective. I think that the years thing has some sort of merit around maybe exposure in terms of time and what you've seen in interactions. I think the product part is definitely one part of it, but the other part is working with others and having a really deep understanding of products and how something is working, how an organization works. Because I think whilst you can maybe ship a lot of things and you've had a lot of those repetitions, there's also an underlying element there. How did you get there? What were some of the processes that you used to get to that point? And often they can be very chaotic, especially if it's a company that's still growing and evolving. And I think you see this in the evolution of startups. Let's say you go from seed to Series A, and then now Series B, when everybody wants to get a little bit more serious and try to get like processes in place. You sometimes see that earlier employees maybe find that a bit of a struggle to say, okay, how do I get from where I was into fitting into this new style of an organization? How do I get a little bit more on point with my planning, with my communication, and not being able to just pull a string here, because I know Tanja very well, because Tanja's already got her own sort of topics that she has to be working on, because we've gone through this entire planning cycle. So I think the repetition is really great. I think that it's also the how you've done it and what you've done, and your ability to then evolve into maybe a little bit more process driven, and really being able to embrace that. And also, I think we talked about this, just also being able to understand, like, the organization is changing. I also need to change.
Yes.
Right. I can't do things how I did them before.
Yeah.
So I think that I've not heard someone talk about the repetition part. I think it's quite interesting, because, I started myself in a really big company. And if I compare myself to people that worked in a startup, I didn't ship as much stuff. But I think definitely what I got is a very deep understanding of the products, of the organizational, team topologies, and the kind of evolution of change, and then working in a heavily regulated environment and what that means, which then maybe served me well, because I just had time to really focus on my craft. And I think the last point is also, it depends on your learning style. So I'm someone who learns much better in a very secure and calm environment. So it might be that if you compare me 5 years down the line to someone who's been in a startup for 5 years, we're going to be strong at different things. And it really depends on what that next organization is looking for in a senior person. So we'll come with 2 completely different things. So I think it's a very contextual, very kind of nuanced thing that, and I really like that you brought it up, because we don't talk enough about this. We don't talk, because we make it very cookie cutter, like 3 to 5 years. I've done that in job descriptions myself. some people you see 5 years, they're over ready for the role. And then some people, 5 years and they're like not quite ready because they haven't had as much exposure. So I think it also really depends on what you are looking for as an organization.
Yeah, and I think what I wanted to bring up with this example of the repetitions is that I have seen people who have been in this role for only 2 years, but they have managed a large scope and they have had a lot of learning loops because they have shipped very fast. And it's not about the shipping, it's about how often you learn, you measure, learn and tweak and so on. And that has brought them up in the seniority, I guess, in that sense, or they were exposed to shareholders much earlier than somebody in a bigger organization. So I'm just saying, like, let's not dismiss people for seniority or senior titles when they just had a couple of years of experience, because sometimes they have worked in a different role before, or they just had a very steep learning curve, right? And I think all the things that we talked about being easy to give feedback to and so on, they can propel you forward. And so just because you have been in the field for only a couple of years doesn't mean that you're not senior, but also the reverse thing is true. Just because you have been in a role for 5 years does not automatically make you senior. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. I mean, we will go back to my analogy of driving, right? Someone who's been driving for 2 years and someone driving for 10 years, you look at insurance companies and they're like, oh, the person who's driving for 10 years is like safer just because of time, but it might not be, right? Some people... 2 years they are driving at the level of someone who's been driving for 10 years. I think it's not always so clear. And that's why I'm happy that you brought it up. And I think it's something that needs to be discussed a lot more, right? Because if you think about the fact that people are using AI now to screen applications, you will automatically probably be screened for that, right? Because you don't meet what is the baseline criteria. But that's not fair to someone, as you said, who has shone in that example. But just to go to what you explained, it's the how underneath it, right? The person being able to learn and apply that learning. Not everybody is able to do that with so little experience. And I think the people who can must be given the opportunity. So I think it brings a wider conversation. How do we recruit? How do we screen? What's the criteria? Does it make sense for whatever the organization is trying to do?
That's for another tough question. But we'll definitely...
I think it should. I think this is such a good topic. I think it's going to get very spicy and very interesting. On one hand, these things are great, but on the other hand, it's like, this might not be able to handle as much nuance as we think it should be able to. And is it really a good idea to automatically screen people on time? Probably not.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for sharing your insights. And we will put some links into the show notes, maybe for maturity assessments, where you can have a look if you're interested, and also maybe some books. And let's continue the conversation in another episode. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Product Academy Tough Stuff.
We hope today's tough question gave you practical, actionable insights.
If you enjoyed the episode, do us a favor and leave a rating or review. It will help us grow the podcast and make future episodes even better.
Got a question for us? Send an email to toughstuff@productacademy.ch and ask away. We read any submission and might answer yours in a later episode.
Thank you again for listening. We'll see you next time with another tough challenge to tackle.
Until then, take care.